years with my friends Jorge and Koji, and well, it was certainly very interesting experience. If I may comment on a couple of points raised by our Indian colleague, start to mention developing countries. Yes, that's quite a broad hat. It includes, inter alia, the country with the biggest scientific community in the world, with successful nuclear and space programs, with the biggest film industry in the world, which is certainly different from the Caribbean country with lack of resources, with maybe no interest in these areas. On secrecy, that's quite an irritating cliche, to be frank. The text of ACTA was not made available in December. It was made available in April. By the way, the first version, the first time we had a text of ACTA, had been around the end of November. There was the gap, the entire secrecy thing was around between December and April, not to count with the many unfortunate leaks that we had. So there was little secrecy about it. But there is another hand. We are negotiating a free trade agreement with India. And recently we had a request for access to documents. And we, as we are bound by law, we identified the documents that belong to India, that had been sent. And we checked, as we must do with the Indian government, which opposed the release of all the documents. So it is not a strange thing in international negotiations. A level of discretion has to be kept. But let's be clear, all these processes then are submitted to very demanding democratic processes. They are approved by parliaments, by our member states. It's secrecy. Let's talk a little bit less about that. There are so many points I would like to raise, but I will just come to the impact on multilateral to remind. When you do these issues for too long, like maybe I have done, we tend to have long memory. And I remember years before ACTA, when we went to the TRIPS Council and put enforcement on the agenda to discuss best practices, to present our cases. So not talking at all about improving or changing TRIPS or having new legislation. I remember India blocking this point from the agenda several times. So I think that certainly harms more multilateral when we are afraid, when we prevent partners from discussing the issue. Ultimately, partners, as kids say, they pick the ball and they go and play in their own corner. And they come to an agreement that bounds them, which will not have an effect on India. On this story of generics, let's stop turning an incident that happened 3 years ago into a goal of ACTA. There is nothing in ACTA that will prevent generics. It's not a goal at all to prevent circulation of generics. Generics are essential. Europe has an enormous industry of generics. It's for our health systems, they are absolutely necessary, as they are for India or for Brazil or for Africa. There is nothing in ACTA that will affect generics, and you know very well that these incidents have not been repeated. All caution has been taken that they don't happen again. So I know this is a catchy issue, but it's not the reality of ACTA. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we have... I think we've officially run out of time, but I think we have time for just one more comment there, and then I will even have to leave it at that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Horacio Rangel. I am a partner in the Mexico City law firm Rangel y Rangel, and I am head of the chairman of the International Treaties Committee within the Mexican Bar and the Mexican group of AIPPI. Therefore, in the Mexican group of AIPPI and in the Mexican Bar, there has been an interest in the way ACTA has developed and was adopted. I do not agree, but I do respect the secrecy and the reasons for which negotiations have been kept secret. What I cannot share is the continued secrecy of those negotiations. I submit that it would be very useful to have published in internet, in a web page, the conditions in which a provision was adopted the way it was adopted. it has a definite impact in the way the provision is construed. Before TRIPS was drafted, the way international intellectual property treaties were drafted was clear. Clarity was always the rule in all intellectual property treaties, I know, with no exception. There are some treaties which are more complex than others, like PCT is more complex than Paris, but both are clear. This clarity is not continued when the TRIPS agreement was drafted. And the reason is that an ambiguous text was needed in order to give room for different interpretations. Well, this is understood when a multinational agreement is being negotiated. But here we had the United States, Japan, and Europe as majority members negotiating also with Mexico and Morocco. I wonder why the ambiguous texts that are present in TRIPS are repeated in ACTA, but ambiguous text is already there. Since ambiguity is in the text, then one needs tools to interpret the ambiguous provision in one way or another. So my request is that these conditions, the minutes and the conditions in which a provision was adopted, be published. This is one statement. The second brief statement I want to make has to do with an opinion that has recently circulated around the world, an opinion drafted by a group of European scholars, professors, some of them, who have attacked the text of ACTA for various reasons. One of these reasons is, two of them I will point out. One of them is that ACTA goes beyond TRIPS. This has already been discussed by our Indian colleague, and I will not insist in that. And our Mexican colleague has also explained the reasons for which parties are free to do that as members of the Paris Convention. Article 19 of the Paris Convention allows that. But the topic that really concerns is the critics on the ACTA provisions, the criticism expressed on the ACTA provisions by reason of being in violation of human rights, according to this opinion by European scholars. I wonder if European scholars are aware that the target of these provisions is organized crime. I agree that human rights pertain to the human race, regardless of whether they are criminals, organized criminals, or street robbers. But I was surprised to read such a defense in favor of organized crime by raising human rights issues in this opinion drafted by the most distinguished scholars I know in Europe. I wonder if the officers involved in ACTA have an opinion on that opinion made public by the European scholars a few days ago, actually. Thanks very much.
Thank you. We're already quite a bit over time. I think no matter when we stopped this discussion, we would always have other points to make and other questions. So perhaps it's a session that should be given twice the amount of time that it actually had today. I think maybe the people involved could address those after we leave, but I think we'll have to cut it short there. I'd like to say a big thank you to all our speakers today for coming along and for giving their presentations, and thank you also for being here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen. The following session will be dealing with securing the supply chain. For those of you who are interested for the power of education and awareness in building respect for IP, this one will take place in the other conference hall. I ask you to start on time also and to finish on time, since we have the glossary plenary afterwards and we have quite a tight schedule. Thank you. By the? That's the role of customs, no? We shouldn't say that. We shouldn't say that with the microphone. Okay. Hi again. We will start the last session of the day before the plenary and the closing plenary. This session will be devoted to the securing the supply chain and understanding the customer. It has been questioned a lot of customer in this Congress. And to be the moderator of this session, we will have Mr. Paul Warrenson, who is partner of the Intellectual Property Department of Baker McKenzie in the United Kingdom. This session will last until 4:30 sharp because the plenary will conference room upstairs. Paul, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. So, just in case you've got the wrong room, this is securing the supply chain. And you have to listen because there are no slides. So each of the speakers in a second will talk about some particular topics. First of all, I'd like to introduce the speakers very quickly, starting with Bob at the very end. Bob Barchesi currently serves as the president of the IECC, a well-known US anti-counterfeiting organization representing the interests of some 200 members across industry and trade groups. Bob also served as the Director of Investigations at the Recording Industry Association of America. And before that, he was in the NYPD, amongst other things, in charge of various things, special agent in charge of investigations, and in the US Virgin Islands, and chief of police in Crystal River, Florida. So Bob's well qualified to roll his sleeves up and talk about the issues in the US. Darcy, who I will hereinafter refer to as the boatman, is second furthest from my right. Darcy began his anti-counterfeiting career right here in France when he was with Danone, the French group Danone, starting with some interesting anti-counterfeiting cases in Egypt, I believe, Darcy. And he was also legal director for Merck in the Middle East and Africa, reducing the deadly trade in smuggled and counterfeit merchandise for Merck. He was also director of the PSI, the Pharmaceutical Security Institute, representing 22 pharmaceutical companies, overseeing worldwide investigations into criminal counterfeit networks. And in that role, he expedited the arrests of counterfeiters in France, Italy, and South Africa, and also did undercover work in Tijuana. And his work there was submitted to the US Congress, and that made counterfeit medicines a priority for the US Drugs Administration. Darcy also worked for the cigarette industry for several years in Eastern and Central Europe, and he's now the Director of Anti-Counterfeiting for CropLife International, advising 6 major pesticide companies on the dangers of pesticides in worldwide trade. He's also an American